Everyone has heard of the Sumerians, Babylon, and Assyria. Ancient Egypt hardly needs an introduction, yet alongside them in both time and place, there was a civilization that endured for nearly 3,000 years, developed its own writing system, held its own against its neighbors, and left behind remarkable monuments that still stand today. And yet, Elam has remained largely forgotten, mentioned only in passing in discussions of Mesopotamian history. It's time to change that. Around 4200 BC, farming communities across the Fertile Crescent began to grow into cities. Susa emerged on the Khuzestan Plain in southwestern Iran at roughly the same time as the earliest Sumerian cities. On the Susiana Plain, fed by rivers flowing down from the Zagros Mountains, offered ideal conditions for agriculture. Its climate supported a wide range of crops as well as cattle, sheep, and goat herding. Agricultural surplus, in turn, made urban life and population growth possible. Archaeological evidence shows more than 6,000 years of continuous habitation, making Susa one of the longest-lived cities in the world. Older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, and as old as civilization itself. Around 3400 BC, another major center appeared in the mountainous region to the east, Anshan. In its early period, Anshan may have even surpassed Susa in scale. The city covered roughly 50 hectares, with fortified areas extending to nearly 200. The coexistence of two worlds, the lowlands and the highlands, would shape the character of Elamite civilization for millennia. Susa represented the fertile plains, closely tied to Mesopotamian culture and trade. Anshan was a mountain stronghold, rich in resources scarce in the river valleys: timber, stone, copper, silver, lead, precious stones, obsidian, and more. Around 3100 BC, the people of the region developed their own writing system, known as Proto-Elamite. It consisted of more than 1,000 signs and appeared almost at the same time as Sumerian cuneiform. Proto-Elamite tablets have been found across the Iranian plateau. The script remains undeciphered and is one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. We can only identify numerical symbols and markers for goods, but the language it recorded and the ideas it expressed remain unknown. Some scholars even suggest that it may have represented a completely different language, unrelated to later Elamite. We do know that the Elamites spoke a language isolate, unrelated to any known language family. It was neither Semitic, like Akkadian, nor Indo-European, like Persian, not even related to Sumerian, despite the close proximity of these peoples. Linguists often compare the gap between Elamite and its neighbors to the difference between Chinese and English. This linguistic uniqueness reflected a broader cultural distinctiveness. The Elamites borrowed from Mesopotamia only what they truly needed: cuneiform, certain religious ideas, and artistic motifs. Yet despite outside influences, they preserved their own identity with remarkable consistency. By 2500 BC, evidence appears of contact between Elam and the Indus Valley civilization, more than 2,000 kilometers to the east. Distinctive pottery, cylinder seals with South Asian motifs, and traded goods show that Elam was a crucial link connecting the great civilizations of the Bronze Age. Copper from Oman, tin from Afghanistan, ivory from India, lapis lazuli from the mountains, all of it reached Mesopotamia along trade routes that passed through Elam. Around 2700 BC, according to the Sumerian king list, the ruler En-Meberachesi of Kish launched a campaign against Elam and emerged victorious. This marks the earliest documented war in history and set a pattern that would repeat for centuries. Mesopotamian states pushed eastward to control trade routes and resources. The Elamites resisted, suffered defeat, recovered, and eventually went on the offensive themselves. The earliest Elamite dynasty that can be clearly identified in the sources is the Awan dynasty, named after a region whose exact location remains debated. The Susa king list records 12 of its rulers, though for most we know little more than their names. What matters is that by around 2400 BC, Elam had already existed as a fully formed kingdom, a contemporary of the Akkadian state, soon to become the dominant power in Mesopotamia. Around 2350 BC, Sargon of Akkad, the first great empire builder, conquered part of Elam and reduced the king of Susa to a vassal. Anshan, however, deeper into the mountains, remained independent. This pattern would repeat again and again. When lowland Elam fell to Mesopotamian rulers, the mountainous regions provided refuge and became a base for resistance and ultimately the restoration of Elamite independence. During the period of Akkadian rule, Sargon and his successors introduced Akkadian cuneiform in the conquered territories, replacing Proto-Elamite writing. At first, records were written exclusively in Akkadian, but before long, the script was adapted to suit the Elamite language as well. Most of the written sources that survive today take the form of cuneiform tablets written in this Elamite cuneiform. Around 2240 BC, Kutik-in-Shushanak, the governor of Susa, took advantage of Akkad's weakening after the Gutian invasions and rose in revolt. For a brief period, he united Susa and Anshan, proclaimed independence, and notably introduced a new writing system known as Linear Elamite. This was Elam's second indigenous script, simpler than Proto-Elamite and made up of roughly 100 signs. It functioned as a syllabary, with each sign representing a full syllable. Linear Elamite was used for some time along Elamite cuneiform, but eventually disappeared. For many years, the script remained undeciphered, until it was finally deciphered in 2018 by the French scholar François de Sète. Around 2100 BC, the Sumerian king Shulgi of the 3rd dynasty of Ur restored Sumerian power, reconquered Susa, installed governors, and incorporated Elam into Ur's sophisticated administrative system. Tablets show that Sumerian officials exercised full control over Elamite lands. For nearly a century, it may have seemed that Elam would gradually be absorbed into Sumerian culture, yet the mountainous regions of Anshan and Shimashki remained independent. That situation did not last. The state of the 3rd dynasty of Ur entered a period of decline, driven by both instability and the rigidity of its own bureaucratic system, and by constant pressure from Amorite tribes advancing from the north. In 2004 BC, the armies of King Khutra-Tempti of the Shimashki dynasty freed Elam from Sumerian rule and captured Ur itself. The Elamites took Ibisin, the last king of Ur, captive and carried him off to Anshan, along with the great statue of Nana, the moon god and patron deity of the city. The sack and destruction of Ur marked the end of Sumerian political hegemony. Sumerian cities would never again build empires. For a time, a power vacuum opened in Mesopotamia. No state was strong enough to unite the entire region under a single authority. This gave Elam the opportunity to consolidate and rise. For several decades after the fall of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, Elam became the dominant power in southern Mesopotamia, until Hammurabi around 1760 BC drove out the Elamites and founded the Old Babylonian Kingdom. According to the Mesopotamian sources and later Elamite inscriptions, the kingdom followed an unusual system of succession. When a ruler died, power did not pass on to his son, but to one of his brothers. If the king had no brothers, the heir was the son of the sister, the king's nephew, through a female line. In effect, succession followed a matrilineal principle. The throne moved sequentially among all the brothers of one generation, and only then passed to the next generation through a woman. This system differed sharply from the patriarchal dynasties typical of Mesopotamia. This arrangement greatly strengthened the role of the family and clan to which the king belonged. Decisions were often made collectively by clan elders, and kings were less absolute rulers than representatives of the ruling family's will. Such a structure significantly increased the stability of Elamite dynasties compared with systems in which power passed directly from father to son. It also largely eliminated the risk of a minor ascending the throne and becoming a puppet in the hands of regents, a situation that repeatedly occurred in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and other Bronze Age states. For this reason, some scholars describe Elamite ruling families as corporate dynasties. This period gives us our first clear glimpse into Elamite religion, thanks to a unique treaty between the Akkadian king Naram-Sin and the Elamite ruler Hita. Written in Old Elamite using Akkadian cuneiform, the agreement opens with an invocation of Elamite gods, alongside several Mesopotamian deities. It lists around 40 gods, the earliest complete record of the Elamite pantheon, with the names of 33 preserved. The Elamite pantheon took shape through the merging of the pantheons of different regions that made up Elam, which explains why many deities shared overlapping roles. Several gods and goddesses bore the title Great God, a designation that can be understood as supreme deity. These included Inshushinak, Naparisha, Humban, Nahunte, and Kiririsha. Inshushinak, the lord of Susa, was the chief patron of the capital and one of the most important gods of the lowlands. His cult was closely linked to royal authority, and his name appears in the names and epithets of many Elamite rulers, including Puzur-Inshushinak, the last king of the Awan dynasty. He was also associated with justice and the underworld, and in Mesopotamian texts, he was sometimes identified with Ninurta. Humban, whose name likely derives from the Elamite verb huba, meaning to command, only rose to major prominence in the Neo-Elamite period. By then, many kings had incorporated his name into their own, such as Humban Nikash I. At least 13 Neo-Elamite rulers bore theophoric names that included Humban's name, roughly half of all the kings of that period. Naparisha, the supreme god of the highland regions and the dynastic deity of Anshan, is generally regarded as one of the most important figures in the Elamite pantheon. His consort was Kiririsha, the great goddess. She was the patron deity of the port city of Leon and is attested in votive inscriptions as early as the 19th century BC. Elamite texts refer to her as the mother of the gods. The god Hutran, associated with Awan, was believed to be the son of Naparisha and Kiririsha. Nahunte was the Elamite sun god. Though no temples dedicated specifically to him have been found, he appears frequently in the names of Elamite kings, including Shutruk-Nahhunte. In religious and legal texts, Nahunte is often mentioned alongside Inshushinak as the Lord of Light, complementing Inshushinak's association with darkness. Pinikir, an astral goddess embodying the planet Venus, was known in the Elamite world as the mistress of the heavens and associated with love and sexuality. Although early scholars mistakenly identified her with Kiririsha, modern research has shown that they were distinct deities from different parts of Elam, Pinikir originating in Awan and Kiririsha in Leon. All of these deities remained central to Elamite religion. Over time, the Elamites, especially those from the lowland regions, also began to worship Mesopotamian gods. Shamash, the god of sun and justice, was venerated in Susa, and evidence has been found for cults of Marduk, Ea, Adad, and Shala in Elam. Around 1500 BC, new dynasties emerged in Elam, gradually transforming it into a major power of the ancient Near East. Rulers of the Kadinuid line adopted the title King of Anshan and Susa, and Elamite began to appear with increasing frequency in royal inscriptions. Earlier rulers had written mainly in Akkadian, both to maintain close ties with Mesopotamia and to draw on the prestige of Sumerian Akkadian culture. The new kings, however, established Elamite as the language of state authority. This shift, often described as the Elamization of Susiana, reflected a growing sense of cultural self-awareness. The most impressive architectural achievement of this period was the complex built around 1250 BC under King Untash-Naparisha. About 30 kilometers southeast of Susa, he founded a vast religious center, Dur Untash, the city of Untash, today known as Chogha Zanbil. At its center stood a ziggurat, dedicated to Inshushinak and Naparisha, the principal gods of lowland and highland Elam. The tower's base measured 105 meters on each side, and its height reached 53 meters, a monumental artificial mountain visible for many kilometers across the flat plain. Millions of bricks went into its construction. Every 10th course of the outer facing contained bricks inscribed in honor of Inshushinak, with the name and titles of Untashnaparisha repeated thousands of times around the entire perimeter of the Ziggurat. The sacred complex was enclosed by 3 concentric walls. The outermost, roughly 4 kilometers long, was pierced by 7 gates. Within the city stood numerous temples dedicated to gods from both the Elamite and Mesopotamian pantheons. Temple entrances were guarded by glazed terracotta bulls and winged griffins, while wooden doors were decorated with glass rods bearing spiral patterns. The level of engineering and artistic craftsmanship rivaled and in some respects surpassed the finest monuments of Mesopotamia. Untashnaparisha set out to create a new religious capital that would unite the gods of all the lands of Elam, a sacred city designed to attract pilgrims and strengthen the authority of the ruling dynasty. The vision, however, was never fully realized, because after Untashnaparisha's death around 1240 BC, construction came to a halt. When French archaeologists began excavations in the 1950s, thousands of unused bricks were still stacked on the site, silent testimony to abandoned ambitions. Of the 22 temples originally planned, only about half were ever built. The complex likely continued to function as a pilgrimage center for several centuries, but it never became the religious capital Untashnaparisha had imagined. Even so, Chogha Zanbil remains the best preserved ziggurat outside of Mesopotamia, and in 1979 it became Iran's first site to be inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. Around 1158 BC, a new dynasty arose in Elam. Shutruk-Nahhunte I came to power and founded the Shutrukid dynasty. His first major campaign was directed against Babylon, then ruled by the Kassite dynasty, which had controlled southern Mesopotamia for more than 4 centuries. Shutruk-Nahhunte captured Babylon by assault, executed King Zababa Shuma Edina, and briefly placed his son Kutur-Nahhunte II on the Babylonian throne. Shutruk-Nahhunte's armies carried off many of Babylon's most important monuments to Elam, including Naram-Sin's victory stele, the obelisk of Menishtushu, the Diorid stele bearing the code of Hammurabi, and the massive statue of Marduk, Babylon's chief god. This was a deliberate seizure of symbols of Mesopotamian prestige, meant to proclaim Elam's supremacy. Shutruk-Nahhunte ordered Elamite inscriptions carved on the captured monuments, in which he styled himself the beloved servant of Inshushinak, king of Anshan and Susa, and declared that he had defeated the Mesopotamian cities and brought their sacred objects to Elam as offerings to his gods. One inscription preserves his voice directly. "I am Shutruk-Nahhunte, son of Halutush Inshushinak. I destroyed Sippar. I took the stele of Naram-Sin and brought it to Elam. I gave it to Inshushinak, my god." By carrying off statues of gods and royal monuments, Shutruk-Nahhunte was claiming spiritual supremacy over Mesopotamia, suggesting that the fate of Babylon now lie in the hands of Elamite deities. Elamite rule in Babylon was short-lived. After only 3 years, the Babylonians rose in revolt and expelled the Elamites. Even so, the invasion brought the Kassite dynasty to an end and plunged Babylonia into a deep crisis. This, in turn, created an opening for the rise of the Assyrian Empire in northern Mesopotamia. His son, Shilak-Inshushinak, brought Elamite power to its peak. Between roughly 1150 and 1120 BC, he launched a series of campaigns that temporarily placed the entire region east of the Tigris under Elamite control. Elam's influence stretched from the Persian Gulf almost to the future site of Persepolis. For a brief moment, Elam became the leading power of the Near East, extracting tribute from Babylonia, controlling major trade routes, and imposing its will on ancient cities that had once ruled empires themselves. That dominance did not last. Around 1120 BC, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar I launched a counteroffensive that reshaped the balance of power. His forces captured Susa and returned the statue of Marduk to Babylon. Babylonian chronicles portrayed this as a divine restoration, a god returning to his rightful home. For Elam, this marked the end of its golden age. The Shutruk dynasty survived one more generation. Its last king, Lutush and Shushanak, fled to Anshan after Nebuchadnezzar's attack, later returned to Susa, but was no longer able to restore Elam's former power. But around 1100 BC, Elamite sources virtually disappear for nearly 3 centuries. In Mesopotamian texts, Elam is mentioned mainly in accounts of minor raids or failed alliances. Archaeological evidence points to a clear decline. Major cities lost much of their population. Scholars refer to this period as the Elamite Dark Ages. Trade networks collapsed, literacy declined, and once powerful states fragmented into smaller polities. Scattered references suggest that Elam broke apart into several small kingdoms. At times they allied with Babylon or with Chaldean tribes against the rising power of Assyria. At other times they fought among themselves. They no longer acted as a unified force, capable of challenging Babylon as they once had. A continuous historical narrative resumes only in the 8th century BC, but the new Elam that reappears in the sources was very different from its earlier form. Power was divided among multiple dynasties from both the lowland and highland regions, constantly competing with one another. This lack of internal unity left Elam unable to effectively resist the new and formidable power that had emerged in Mesopotamia, Assyria. By the late 8th century BC, Elam entered into an anti-Assyrian alliance with the Babylonian king Merodach-Baladan. Around 700 BC, the Assyrian king Sennacherib defeated the combined Elamite Babylonian forces and then placed his own son on the Babylonian throne. Elam was no longer capable of opposing Mesopotamian power as it once had, and the balance of power had shifted permanently. In 653 BC, the Elamite king Tuman invaded the Assyrian border regions, apparently believing that Assyria had been weakened by internal power struggles in Nineveh. The decision proved fatal. At the time, Assyria was ruled by Ashurbanipal, one of its most formidable kings. He launched a punitive campaign that culminated in the Battle of Tel-Tuba, where the Assyrians annihilated the Elamite army. Tuman fled in his chariot, but was overtaken and beheaded, a surprisingly merciful fate by Assyrian standards. Palace reliefs from Nineveh showed Tuman's severed head hanging from a tree, while Ashurbanipal and his queen reclined with drinks, attended by servants and musicians. The true catastrophe for Elam came 7 years later, in 646 BC, when Ashurbanipal decided that Elam's constant interference in Babylonian-Assyrian affairs had gone far enough. The Elamites had supported the rebellion of the Babylonian ruler Shamash-shum-ukin and had given refuge to fugitives after Ashurbanipal crushed the Babylonian uprising. Determined to eliminate the Elamite threat once and for all, Ashurbanipal launched a campaign that was, in effect, a war of annihilation. Assyrian armies swept across Elam from end to end, devastating cities, burning crops, and destroying irrigation systems. In his own inscriptions, Ashurbanipal describes his actions with cold pride. Susa, the great holy city, the dwelling of their gods, the place of their mysteries, I conquered. I entered its palaces and opened its treasuries, where silver and gold, wealth and possessions were piled up. I destroyed the Ziggurat of Susa and smashed its gleaming bronze horns. I utterly destroyed the temples of Elam. Their gods and goddesses I scattered to the winds. The tombs of their kings, ancient and recent alike, I desecrated, exposed to the sun, and carried off their bones to the land of Assur. I devastated the provinces of Elam and sowed salt upon their lands. The desecration of royal tombs, the removal of ancestral bones, and the salting of the earth to render it lifeless were acts meant to erase Elam not only as a state, but as a spiritual community, to curse the land itself and make it unfit for life. The last significant king of Elam was Ashurbanipal III. When Susa fell, the Assyrians captured him and brought him to Nineveh, where Ashurbanipal publicly humiliated him by forcing him, along with other defeated rulers, to pull the royal chariot like a daft animal through the streets of the Assyrian capital among the jeers of the crowd. The irony is that the destruction of Elam hastened the fall of Assyria itself. The campaign drained the empire's resources, required enormous financial outlays, and inflicted heavy losses on elite Assyrian troops. In the very next generation, the lands of Elam were filled by the Medes and Persians, Indo-Iranian peoples. In 612 BC, just 34 years after the destruction of Susa, a coalition of Medes and Babylonians destroyed Nineveh, the magnificent capital of Assyria. Around 650 BC, the Persian leader Tiesbes founded a small kingdom in Anshan, the same Anshan that served as Elam's mountain stronghold for more than 2,000 years. His descendants continued to bear the title King of Anshan, even after conquering Media, Lydia, and Babylon. When Cyrus the Great called himself King of Anshan and Susa before becoming King of Persia, he was deliberately appealing to Elamite traditions of rulership and presenting himself as the heir to an ancient established legitimacy. Even the name Cyrus itself has Elamite origins. The Persians adopted Elamite administrative practices, retained elements of Elamite religious tradition, and continued to use Elamite as a working language of government. When the Achaemenid Empire conquered Babylon in 539 BC and began to build a state stretching from Egypt to Central Asia, Cyrus shaped its institutions as a synthesis of Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian models on one hand and Elamite traditions on the other. Susa became one of the capitals of the vast Persian Empire, alongside Persepolis, Pasargadae, and Ecbatana. Persian rulers wintered there, conducted state business, and relied on Elamite scribes to run the imperial administration. At Persepolis, more than 30,000 cuneiform tablets written in Elamite have been discovered, a detailed archive of everyday governance, recording food distributions, payments to workers, and the movement of resources across thousands of kilometers. These documents regularly mention officials traveling from Susa to Egypt, India, or Lydia, and then returning again. The famous Behistun inscription, a monumental proclamation by Darius I carved in 522 BC, was written in 3 languages: Old Persian, Akkadian, and Elamite. This trilingual text became the key to deciphering cuneiform in the 19th century, but it also reveals something else. Within the Achaemenid Empire, Elamite held the same official status as Persian and Akkadian. More than that, certain features of the inscription suggest that the Elamite version may have been the original text, from which the others were translated. Around 147 BC, a new state emerged in the Persian Gulf region, Elamaeus, and its capital, Susa. Its rulers bore the name Kamnaskir, derived from the old Elamite word Kabnashkir, meaning treasurer, likely reflecting the fact that Susa had housed the imperial treasury under the Achaemenids. The Elamite language survived as a spoken language for an astonishingly long time. In the Acts of the Apostles, written around 80 to 90 AD, Elamites are mentioned among the peoples who heard the gospel at Pentecost. The Talmud reports that the Torah was read annually in Elamite for the Jewish community of Susa. Together, these references point to linguistic continuity nearly 1,000 years after Elam was destroyed by Ashurbanipal. Around 224 AD, Elamaeus was conquered by the Sasanian Empire. This marked the formal end of a distinct Elamite political history, roughly 4,002 years after the founding of Susa, making Elamite civilization comparable in longevity to ancient Egypt and longer lived than many far more famous cultures. The diorite stele bearing the Code of Hammurabi now stands in the Louvre. Visitors photograph it, admire this ancient vision of justice, and almost never notice the Elamite inscription. I am Shutruk-Nahhunte, son of Halatush and Shushanak, beloved servant of Shushanak. When the god Shushanak granted me kingship, I destroyed Sippar, took the stele of Naram-Sin and the stele of Hammurabi, and brought them to Elam. I set them up as an offering to my lord Shushanak. This inscription, a brief moment of Elamite confidence and power, connects us to a civilization most people have never even heard of, yet one that helps shape the world that we live in. If you made it to the end of this video, we really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. Follow along on our journey through ancient civilizations and history. If you'd like to support the channel, join our Patreon or become a YouTube channel member. You get early access to new episodes, behind-the-scenes looks, and more. You can also leave a super thanks below to give us a little extra boost. If you want to listen to history on the go, check out our all-new podcast, Parabellum History. You can find it on all major podcast platforms. Thanks again for tuning in, and we hope to see you next time.